The waitress with hidden dreams. The evening at La Fontaine was alive in the way only a Friday night could be. Nestled in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina, the upscale restaurant was the kind of place where wealthy couples came to celebrate anniversaries, where business moguls shook hands over expensive bottles of Bordeaux, and where politicians whispered plans between courses of seared duck and saffron risotto. Every corner of the room glowed with golden light that bounced off polished glasses and silver cutlery, creating an ambiance of refined luxury. The murmur of conversations wove together into a low, steady hum, punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of wine against crystal. At the far end of the dining room sat a glossy black grand piano, its curved body gleaming under the chandeliers, though on most nights it remained untouched, a silent symbol of sophistication more than a source of music. Naomi Carter moved through this world with practiced grace, balancing trays, weaving between chairs, and offering warm smiles to guests who barely noticed her, beyond the efficiency of her service. At 25, she had already mastered the art of invisibility, blending into the background of wealthy lives she could never afford. Her uniform, crisp white blouse, black skirt, polished shoes, gave her the appearance of professionalism, but it also stripped away individuality, reducing her to just another pair of hands delivering food and drinks. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was a woman who carried more than just plates. She carried a history, a set of dreams, and a passion that refused to die, no matter how much reality tried to smother it. Music had been Naomi's sanctuary since childhood. Growing up in a modest South Carolina town, her family never had much. Her mother, Clara, was a nurse who worked long hours at the county hospital, often leaving Naomi and her two younger brothers in the care of neighbors. Life was not easy. Bills piled up, second-hand clothes were the norm, and dreams of grandeur felt as distant as the moon. But music was always within reach. When Naomi was 8, a neighbor gifted the family an old upright piano, its ivory keys chipped, its wood scarred by years of use. To most it was little more than a piece of junk, but to Naomi it was a portal to another world. She would sit on its worn bench for hours, mimicking the melodies she heard on the radio, fumbling through hymns from the church choir, and later teaching herself classical pieces from dog-eared sheet music she scavenged at thrift stores. By the time she was a teenager, her raw talent had blossomed into something undeniable. She played at Sunday services, at school recitals, and even at small community events where people marveled at the way her fingers seemed to glide effortlessly over the keys. Teachers spoke of scholarships, of conservatories, of a future that could be so much brighter than her present. But dreams often meet their hardest test when weighed against reality. Her mother's health faltered just as Naomi graduated high school, and the burden of helping support the family fell on her shoulders. The scholarship letters never came, and the conservatory auditions became a distant fantasy. Instead, she put aside the sheet music and picked up double shifts at diners, telling herself that one day, someday, the opportunity would return. When Naomi moved to Raleigh at 21, it was not for adventure but for survival. She needed steady work and found it at La Fontaine, a restaurant whose reputation promised good tips and stable hours. At first it was just a job, but the first time she walked into the dining room and saw the grand piano gleaming in the corner, her breath caught. It was a Steinway, perfectly tuned, far grander than anything she had ever touched. Though she never dared to play it during service, just knowing it was there felt like having a secret ally, a reminder that her passion was not dead, only waiting for its time to rise again. On quiet afternoons when the restaurant was closed, she sometimes asked the manager for permission to practice, filling the empty dining hall with music that echoed against marble floors and crystal chandeliers. To her co-workers, Naomi's gift was no secret. They had heard her play during breaks and whispered among themselves that she deserved a stage far larger than a restaurant corner. But to the patrons, she was invisible, just another waitress. That evening, Naomi tied her curly hair into a neat bun and adjusted her apron before stepping onto the floor. The dinner rush had begun and the restaurant was a hive of activity. She glided from table to table, serving cocktails, explaining specials, and balancing the unspoken demands of wealthy customers who often treated servers as part of the decor rather than human beings. Yet Naomi bore it all with quiet dignity. Her co-workers admired her patience, her ability to smile even when confronted with arrogance, and the way she never allowed rudeness to chip away at her self-respect. For Naomi, dignity was her shield and music was her soul. It was just past 8 when the restaurant's doors swung open and a figure stepped inside, who immediately altered the atmosphere. Damien Cross did not need to announce his presence. It announced itself. Tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, with a watch worth more than most cars glinting on his wrist, Damien walked as though the world bent around him. He was flanked by 3 companions, 2 men and a woman, each equally polished, their laughter too loud, their confidence bordering on arrogance. Damien's reputation preceded him, a self-made millionaire in real estate and tech investments, known as much for his wealth as for his sharp tongue and ruthless treatment of those he considered beneath him. Staff members exchanged wary glances the moment he entered. He was not a man who dined quietly. Naomi, balancing a tray of sparkling water, felt the weight of his presence immediately. She did not need to be told which table was his. The room seemed to gravitate toward him, his entourage claiming the prime spot near the piano. Their arrival shifted the energy of the entire restaurant. Diners glanced at them with a mixture of curiosity and irritation, while waiters straightened their postures as if preparing for inspection. Damien thrived on such attention. He was the kind of man who considered other people's discomfort a form of entertainment. When Naomi approached their table, she did so with the same calm professionalism she gave every customer. She greeted them warmly, her voice steady, her tray balanced with effortless precision. Damien's gaze flicked to her name tag, then lingered on her face with a look that felt more like an appraisal than a glance. A slow smirk curled at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that suggested he had already decided something about her, though she could not guess what. "Naomi," he said smoothly, his tone rich with mockery disguised as charm. "A lovely name. Tell me, Naomi, do you do more than just carry trays?" The comment was casual enough to pass as small talk, but there was an edge beneath it that made Naomi's stomach tighten. She answered politely, her eyes not lingering too long on his. "I'm here to serve tonight, sir. May I start you with something to drink?" Damien chuckled, exchanging a glance with his companions, who laughed dutifully at his every word. "Scotch neat. The oldest bottle you have," he ordered, before leaning back in his chair. His gaze did not leave Naomi as she wrote down the order. It was not the gaze of admiration, but of amusement, as though she were already part of a game only he understood. Naomi excused herself and walked briskly toward the bar, refusing to let the unease show on her face. She had dealt with difficult customers before, arrogant executives, entitled politicians, drunken partygoers. But something about Damien felt different. His presence was heavy, calculated, as if he delighted in making others squirm. She reminded herself that he was just another guest, just another table to serve, nothing more. Yet deep down, she felt the faint chill of intuition whispering that the night would not be ordinary. By the time she returned with the scotch, Damien was in full performance mode, regaling his table with stories of his business triumphs, each tale dripping with exaggeration and condescension. His companions laughed on cue, feeding his ego, while nearby diners exchanged irritated glances at the volume of his voice. Naomi set down his drink with care, offering a polite smile, but Damien's eyes never left her. He studied her like a chess piece he was already planning to move. "Tell me, Naomi," he said suddenly, cutting through the noise. "What does a young woman like you dream of? Surely you don't imagine carrying plates forever?" The question caught her off guard. Waitresses were rarely asked about their dreams by customers, and when they were, it was seldom genuine. Naomi hesitated, debating whether to brush it off with a safe answer, but something in his gaze compelled her honesty. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps it was a spark of pride she could not suppress, but she replied softly, "I play the piano. When I can." The words hung in the air and Damien's smirk widened. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers as though he had just been handed the perfect opportunity for entertainment. His companions leaned in too, curiosity piqued. "A pianist?" Damien said, his voice booming just enough for nearby tables to hear. "Well, isn't that fascinating? There's a piano right here in the room. Why don't you give us a little performance, Naomi? Show us what you've got." The restaurant seemed to quiet at once, conversations dimming as heads turned toward the exchange. Naomi felt the blood rush to her face, her hands tightening around her order pad. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Oh, I couldn't. I'm working tonight. That wouldn't be appropriate." "Nonsense," Damien declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "What better way to elevate our evening than with a live performance? Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience. His companions chuckled, already envisioning her fumbling at the keys. The trap was set, the humiliation prepared. Naomi stood frozen, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her. She had been invisible moments before, and now, in an instant, she was at the center of a spectacle she had never asked for. And though she tried to steady her breath, she knew with a sinking certainty that Damien Cross was not done with her. Not tonight. The cruel invitation. Air inside La Fontaine shifted as though the chandeliers themselves leaned closer to witness what was unfolding. Conversations at nearby tables softened, forks lingered mid-air, and diners tilted their heads toward Damien Cross and the waitress he had singled out. The grand piano, usually a silent decoration, suddenly loomed larger in the room, its black surface gleaming as though it had been waiting all night for this moment. Naomi Carter stood with her order pad in hand, her posture polite but stiff, the warmth of her usual composure slipping beneath the weight of 100 curious eyes. She had been invisible just an hour earlier, weaving seamlessly between tables carrying trays, unnoticed except for the fleeting gratitude of patrons. Now she was a spectacle, the unwilling centerpiece of Damien's game. The man leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a predator who had already secured his prey. His lips curled in that thin, mocking smile that dared her to refuse him. His companions, polished and eager to laugh at his every word, exchanged glances that sparkled with anticipation. They were ready for a show, ready to watch a waitress stumble through a humiliating performance and confirm what they already believed, that she was a servant, not an artist, and that talent belonged only to those wealthy enough to afford stages. Naomi's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the soles of her feet pressing against the polished floor. She knew what Damien wanted. He did not want to hear her music. He wanted to own the moment, to turn her into a story he could tell later at some glittering cocktail party. I made the waitress play piano at dinner. You should have seen it. She imagined his voice carrying the tale, dripping with condescension, followed by the laughter of men and women who thought dignity was a commodity reserved only for the rich. I really can't, she said softly, her words almost swallowed by the hush of the room. I'm here to work tonight. The piano isn't for me. But Damien's voice rose, commanding and theatrical, ensuring everyone could hear. Don't be modest, Naomi. You said you play and we would all love some entertainment, wouldn't we? His gaze swept across the restaurant, pulling strangers into his orbit. A few nodded out of politeness, others smiled awkwardly, caught in the uncomfortable position of bystanders too polite to object. Naomi glanced toward her manager near the bar, hoping for rescue, but his face was unreadable. Managers in upscale restaurants learned quickly which battles to pick, and Damien Cross, with his wealth and influence, was not someone he would confront. Naomi knew then that if she refused, it would not only embarrass Damien, it might cost her the job she desperately needed. Her mind raced back to her childhood, to the small upright piano in her mother's living room, its keys chipped but its sound pure. That piano had been her refuge after long days at school, the place where she poured her frustrations, her hopes, and her grief. Music had never judged her. Music had never demanded she prove herself. Yet now, in this gilded dining room, music was about to become a weapon wielded against her. Damien leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his tone dripping with mock encouragement. What's the matter? Are you afraid? Afraid the truth might come out? That you're just another dreamer with nothing to show for it? His words struck sharp, not because they were true, but because they grazed wounds she had worked so hard to hide. Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks. Around her, patrons whispered, some sympathetic, some merely curious. Her co-workers, frozen in place with trays half lowered, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Naomi's gift. They had heard her play when no customers were around, had marveled at the way her fingers danced across the keys as though the piano were an extension of her soul. But they also knew what Damien was doing, and it made their stomachs twist with anger. One of his companions, a woman draped in diamonds, leaned closer to Damien and murmured loudly enough for Naomi to hear. She probably can't play at all. Some people like to imagine themselves more talented than they are. The table erupted in laughter, the kind that carried the cruelty of a slap. Naomi's hands tightened around her notepad until the edges dug into her skin. She wanted to walk away, to refuse him outright, to remind herself that her dignity was more important than his approval. But she also knew that in this world, This room filled with wealth and power. Walking away might mean more than just embarrassment. It could mean losing her job, losing the income that kept her mother's medication paid for, losing the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. And then, almost as if the piano itself was calling her, Naomi's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room where the Steinway waited. Its polished surface reflected the chandelier's light, and in that reflection she saw herself. Not as a waitress, not as a servant, but as the girl who once dreamed of concert halls and symphonies. The girl who played not for applause but because music was the only language that ever truly belonged to her. Taking a deep breath, she set down her notepad on the edge of Damien's table and said, her voice steady though her heart shook, "If this is what you want, I'll play." The restaurant held its breath. Damien's smirk widened, his eyes glittering with victory. He leaned back, satisfied as if he had just won a bet. His companions clapped politely, some snickering, others eager to witness her stumble. Naomi walked slowly toward the piano, every step heavy with the knowledge that she was walking into a trap. Yet beneath the fear something else stirred, a quiet defiance, a whisper of strength that had always lived inside her. When she reached the piano, she paused, running her fingers lightly across its surface as though greeting an old friend. The bench was cool beneath her as she sat down, the keys gleaming under the warm light. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the weight of Damien's smirk, the whispers of the diners, the silent judgment of strangers. She thought instead of her mother's voice, soft but firm, "Naomi, your music is a gift. Never let anyone tell you it isn't worth something." Her hands hovered above the keys. The room waited, hushed and expectant. Damien leaned back in his chair, ready to enjoy the spectacle of her failure. Naomi's co-workers held their breath, silently praying she would find the courage they knew she had. And then, with one trembling inhale, Naomi pressed the first note. The sound was soft, uncertain, but it carried across the dining room like the beginning of a confession. A ripple of silence moved through the crowd as she began, her fingers tentative but searching, each note building upon the last. What started as hesitation began to shape itself into melody. The music, fragile at first, grew stronger, deeper, pulling threads of memory and emotion into the air. Damien's smirk faltered. The trap he had set was beginning to unravel, and Naomi, though she did not yet know it, was about to turn his cruel invitation into the beginning of her triumph. The first notes that changed the room. The moment Naomi's fingers touched the ivory keys, the world around her seemed to pause. It was as if time itself leaned in to listen, holding its breath in anticipation. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost fragile, like a whisper unsure of whether it would be heard. The melody trembled, searching for footing the way a child might search for balance when taking their first steps. Some in the audience exchanged smirks, their eyes darting toward Damien as though to confirm their suspicion that this performance would end as nothing more than an awkward stumble. But Naomi kept playing, her hands lingering on the keys, her heart thundering in her chest. With every measure, the tremor in her fingers gave way to a steadier rhythm. She closed her eyes, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to block out the hungry stares of the diners and the mocking smirk of the man who had forced her into this moment. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the old upright piano from her childhood, its keys worn smooth by years of her practice, its sound imperfect but filled with love. She saw herself at 13, bent over sheet music in the dim light of her bedroom, fingers stumbling through Chopin's nocturnes. She saw her mother sitting in the kitchen after a long shift at the hospital, listening quietly as Naomi played to soothe the weariness of the day. When she opened her eyes again, it was not La Fontaine she saw, but the memory of every room she had ever filled with music. And with that memory came confidence. Her fingers moved more surely now, dancing across the keyboard with grace and precision. The tentative whisper of notes swelled into something fuller, deeper, a melody that carried with it a mixture of sorrow and triumph. The music shifted, weaving between classical elegance and gospel warmth, a sound that was both refined and raw, polished yet pulsing with the heartbeat of her soul. The restaurant, once alive with chatter and clinking glasses, had fallen completely silent. Waiters who had been mid-step froze in place, their trays hovering in the air. Diners who had leaned back in their chairs with skepticism now found themselves leaning forward, drawn in against their will by the magnetism of the music. Even the air itself seemed thicker, vibrating with the resonance of her playing. The piano, which had sat for months as a silent ornament in the corner, now spoke with a voice so commanding that it demanded reverence. At Damien's table, the shift was palpable. His companions, who had been preparing to laugh at her expense, now stared in stunned silence, their mocking smiles replaced by expressions of reluctant awe. The diamond-draped woman who had sneered about Naomi's talent pressed her lips together, her laughter dying in her throat as the melody wrapped around her like a truth she could not deny. Damien himself, reclining in smug satisfaction only moments earlier, now sat more upright, his smirk wavering as though each note chipped away at the certainty of his control. Naomi played as though the piano were a conduit for every emotion she had ever buried. She poured into the keys the weight of her unfulfilled dreams, the frustration of years spent waiting tables instead of performing on stages, the resilience that had carried her through every hardship. The music swelled, rich and unrelenting, until it filled every corner of the room. It was not just sound, it was confession, declaration, revelation. Her performance was not an attempt to impress. It was a command to be seen. A man at a nearby table, a retired professor of music from Duke University, felt his throat tighten. He had attended countless concerts, had heard prodigies from around the world, but there was something in Naomi's playing that defied technical critique. It was not merely skill, it was spirit. It was the rare kind of music that could reach inside a person and stir the part of them they had forgotten to nurture. He glanced at his wife, who sat with tears glistening in her eyes, and he knew they were both hearing something extraordinary. Naomi, lost entirely in the world of sound she was creating, no longer felt the weight of the room's judgment. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her fingers moving effortlessly now, each passage flowing into the next with precision and passion. The nervous girl who had hesitated moments before was gone. In her place was a musician, an artist who commanded the respect of every soul within earshot. When she reached the climax of the piece, the notes rose like a tide, fierce and unyielding, before cascading down into a soft, aching resolution. The final chords lingered in the air long after her fingers left the keys, their echoes reverberating against the marble floors and gilded walls. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence was so complete that Naomi could hear her own breath, sharp and uneven in her chest. And then, slowly, as though the audience had been collectively released from a spell, the applause began. It started with a single clap, hesitant and almost reverent, before spreading like wildfire through the room. Diners rose from their seats, their faces lit with astonishment, their hands striking together with genuine fervor. The sound of their applause filled the space Naomi had carved with her music, and for the first time in years she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a server of drinks and plates, but as the artist she had always been. Naomi's coworkers clapped the loudest, their eyes shining with pride. They had always known her secret, but now the world knew it too. The professor from Duke stood, tears in his eyes, and applauded with the kind of conviction reserved for once-in-a-lifetime performances. Even those who had smirked at her earlier now found themselves cheering, caught up in the undeniable power of her gift. At Damien's table, however, the mood was different. His companions clapped with the rest of the room, but their applause was nervous, subdued, as though they feared drawing attention to the man who had orchestrated this cruel game. Damien himself did not clap. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed, his smirk long gone. He sat still, his hands resting motionless on the tablecloth, the sound of the room's celebration echoing around him like an accusation. What had been intended as Naomi's humiliation had become her triumph, and for the first time that evening, Damien Cross was not the center of attention. He was merely a man who had underestimated someone he thought powerless. Naomi rose from the piano bench, her knees trembling, her hands still buzzing with the memory of the keys. She bowed her head slightly, humbled by the applause but also overwhelmed. She had not played for them. She had played for herself, to reclaim the part of her identity she had allowed life to bury. And yet in doing so, she had shaken an entire room, silenced arrogance, and reminded strangers of the transformative power of true talent. As she walked back toward the tables, her coworkers smiled at her, some whispering words of encouragement, others touching her arm with pride. The applause still rang in her ears, but beneath it all, she could feel Damien's glare burning into her back. His trap had failed, his ego had been shattered, and Naomi knew instinctively that his silence was not surrender. It was the simmering anger of a man who had been exposed in front of the very people he sought to impress. And though she had won the moment, Naomi could not shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Ego against talent. For several moments after Naomi returned to her post, the applause still echoed faintly in the restaurant, like the fading ripples of a stone cast into still water. People were buzzing with conversation now, their voices alight with excitement as they recounted what they had just witnessed. "She's extraordinary," murmured one woman in pearls to her husband. "Simply extraordinary." A man at another table leaned forward eagerly, already asking if she taught lessons or if she performed anywhere else. Even the staff, usually careful to remain in the background, allowed themselves to beam with quiet pride as they watched their colleague bask in a glory that felt shared among them all. Naomi stood behind the counter with flushed cheeks, the applause still thrumming in her body like an aftershock, hardly daring to believe what she had just done. For once she was not invisible. For once she was not just the waitress. But amid the swell of admiration, there was one person who could not bear the sound of her triumph. Damien Cross sat rigidly at his table, his wine glass untouched, his smile stretched tight and brittle like glass about to shatter. His companions, sensing the shift, had grown cautious, their laughter subdued as though they feared igniting the temper of the man whose reputation was as powerful as his wealth. Damien's eyes remained fixed on Naomi, dark with something dangerous, a fury sharpened not just by embarrassment, but by the realization that his attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly. In his world, appearances were everything, and tonight, his carefully crafted image as an untouchable arbiter of taste and authority had been publicly cracked by a waitress who was never meant to matter. He leaned back in his chair, the leather of his custom jacket creaking softly, and with a deliberate slowness he began to clap. It was not applause of admiration. It was a cold, mocking rhythm, a gesture meant to reclaim the room's attention. The sound cut through the lingering chatter like a knife, and gradually the clapping of others subsided as eyes turned toward him. Damien rose from his seat, lifting his glass with theatrical poise, and the restaurant fell quiet once again. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth, only condescension. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed space. "Wasn't that charming? A quaint little performance like something one might stumble upon in a subway station or a local church recital?" He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze sweeping the room like a blade. "Pretty, yes. Surprising, perhaps. But let us not pretend we have just witnessed the rebirth of Chopin, or the discovery of a prodigy. Skillful hands do not make an artist, and applause, my dear friends, is not the same as greatness." A murmur ran through the diners, a current of discomfort rippling beneath the surface of his words. Some shifted uneasily in their chairs, torn between the awe they had just experienced and the magnetic authority Damien exuded. He was, after all, a man who built empires, who was invited into circles few could ever reach. His opinion carried weight, and many of the wealthy patrons had grown accustomed to echoing whatever judgment he pronounced. Yet this time there was hesitation. The professor of music frowned deeply, shaking his head as if unable to stay silent. Rising to his feet, he countered in a voice firm with conviction. "Mr. Cross, with all respect, you are wrong. What we witnessed was not quaint, it was remarkable. This young woman played with a depth and authenticity that no amount of training can manufacture. I have sat in grand concert halls across the world, and I tell you this, her performance belongs in those halls." He turned toward Naomi, offering her a respectful nod. "Do not let anyone belittle what you just gave us. That music was not a parlor trick. It was art, pure and true." The professor's words drew a smattering of supportive applause, this time directed not at Naomi's performance, but at the defense of it. Naomi's co-workers clapped again, louder and prouder, and a few diners followed suit, emboldened by his courage. Damien's smile faltered for the briefest instant, but he recovered quickly, swirling his wine in his glass with practiced elegance. "How sentimental," he sneered softly, his eyes never leaving Naomi. "The world is full of dreamers who mistake passion for greatness. But true greatness, ladies and gentlemen, is measured by recognition, by standing, by the respect of the elite who set the standards of art and culture. Tell me, does anyone here know her name? Has anyone ever seen her billed on a marquee or invited to perform at the Lincoln Center? No? Then perhaps we should remember our place. She may be talented, but she is also a waitress. A waitress who played for tips, not for history. The words cut like shards of glass, cruel and deliberate, meant to remind Naomi of the smallness of her life compared to the immensity of his world. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Her chest burning with humiliation. She thought she had escaped only minutes earlier. Yet even as his voice pressed against her like a weight, she felt something inside her shift. She realized then that Damien's dismissal was not truth, it was fear. He feared the way the room had been captivated by her, the way his power had slipped for even a few minutes, the way people looked at her with wonder instead of at him with reverence. His cruelty was not strength. It was desperation, and others saw it too. A woman in the back who had been silent all evening suddenly spoke up. Maybe she hasn't been invited to Lincoln Center because no one ever gave her the chance. Maybe people like you, Mr. Cross, were too busy deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. Her voice trembled, but her words were sharp, slicing through the pretense like lightning. Heads turned toward her, and the murmur of agreement grew louder. The tide of the room was shifting again, away from Damien's authority and toward Naomi's undeniable presence. Naomi lifted her chin slowly, her eyes meeting Damien's across the room. The shame that had gripped her chest loosened, replaced by something steadier, stronger. She did not need his validation. She did not need his approval to define her worth. She had played and they had listened. That was enough. For the first time she saw Damien not as a giant, but as a man whose power was fragile, whose influence was built on smoke and mirrors. The applause rose again, this time not as wild as before, but steady, determined, a show of defiance against the man who had tried to diminish what they all knew they had just witnessed. Damien's face hardened, the mask of amusement slipping to reveal the seething rage beneath. He raised his glass once more, drained it in a single swallow, and slammed it down on the table with finality. "Enjoy your illusions," he muttered, his voice low but audible before turning his gaze away from Naomi altogether. For the first time that evening he looked small. Naomi, standing tall behind the counter, did not feel small at all. The breaking point. The restaurant had become an unexpected stage, and everyone knew they had just witnessed a kind of drama no chef's menu or fine wine could ever compete with. The air carried a charge as though a thunderstorm had passed through, leaving the room thrumming with unspoken energy. Naomi stood quietly behind the counter, her chest still rising and falling with the echoes of the confrontation. She could feel the eyes of strangers resting on her, not as customers gazing at a waitress, but as witnesses seeing a woman who had revealed something raw and true. For so long she had believed her talent lived only in the shadows, only in stolen moments when no one was watching. But tonight it had stepped out into the light, and no matter how Damien Cross tried to diminish it, that light refused to dim. Damien, however, was not used to losing. He sat rigid in his chair, staring at the polished wood of the table as though it personally betrayed him. His companions, usually quick to echo his jokes and validate his arrogance, now shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to support him or admit the obvious, that he had been defeated in the one arena he thought untouchable, commanding a room. The laughter that once followed his every word was gone, replaced by a silence heavy with judgment. For a man like Damien, silence was poison. He clenched his jaw, willing the room back under his control, but it had slipped through his fingers and he knew it. It was then that the professor of music, still visibly stirred by Naomi's performance, approached her table. He was an older man, his shoulders slightly stooped but his presence commanding in a different way, one born of decades of dedication to his craft rather than wealth or intimidation. He removed a card from his pocket and placed it carefully on the counter in front of Naomi. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of opportunity. "Miss Naomi, I am not in the habit of making empty gestures. What I heard tonight was the kind of talent that deserves to be nurtured, to be given a platform far larger than this dining room. I would like to invite you to audition for our conservatory. We have scholarships, and if your audition reflects what you gave us tonight, I have no doubt doors will open for you." Naomi stared at the card as though it were glowing. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the sheer magnitude of what he was offering. For years she had carried the dream like a fragile flame in her chest, shielding it from the winds of reality and responsibility. She had learned to keep it small, to protect herself from disappointment, to accept that life might never grant her the stage she longed for. And now, out of nowhere, in the middle of an ordinary Friday shift, that door was being pushed open. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rush of hope. The room broke into murmurs of approval, and several diners applauded again, not for the professor this time, but for the chance that had been given. It was as if the audience, so accidentally gathered for this moment, wanted to be part of the story unfolding before them. They wanted Naomi to succeed, to grasp the future that had just been placed within her reach. For once, a restaurant filled with wealthy patrons and powerful men was united not in status but in admiration for a young woman who had dared to play from her soul. Damien, unable to endure the sight any longer, rose from his seat with a sudden scrape of the chair against the floor. His voice, though quieter than before, still dripped with disdain. "A scholarship? An audition? Do you people truly believe this? This waitress will ascend into your sacred halls and be anything more than a novelty? You insult the very institutions you claim to represent. She is no more a prodigy than I am a poet. You're indulging a fantasy, and fantasies do not last." But this time no one laughed. No one nodded. No one clapped at his words. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect, but of rejection. For the first time in his life, Damien Cross discovered what it felt like to speak and have no one follow. His authority evaporated in the air, leaving him standing exposed, a man whose wealth could command service but not admiration. He realized, with a sting that went deeper than he cared to admit, that he had lost, not just to Naomi's music, but to her authenticity. Naomi turned slowly to face him. Her voice was steady, low but strong, carrying enough weight that every ear in the restaurant caught it. "You tried to make me small," she said, her words deliberate, each one chosen carefully. "But all you did was show everyone how afraid you are of what you can't control. You think greatness is measured in money and status and how many people bow when you enter a room. But real greatness," she placed her hand over her chest, "comes from here, and that's something you'll never understand." The restaurant erupted, not in laughter but in applause louder than any that had come before. It filled every corner, bounced off every wall, a roar of approval that left Damien standing alone in a spotlight he had not asked for. His face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and without another word he turned sharply on his heel and left the restaurant, his entourage trailing behind him like shadows retreating from the light. The door closed behind them, and for the first time all evening the room felt free. Naomi stood trembling, overwhelmed by the storm she had just weathered. The professor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and several patrons approached her with warm words, offers of support, even promises of connections they could help her pursue. For once she was not invisible. She was the center, the spark, the one who had given them all something unforgettable. She looked down at the card still in her hand, its edges digging gently into her palm, and she knew her life had shifted forever. When she finally returned home that night, exhausted but unable to sleep, Naomi sat at the small second-hand keyboard she kept in her apartment. She ran her fingers across the keys, still hearing the echoes of the applause, still feeling the weight of the professor's card in her pocket. For the first time she allowed herself to believe, not just to dream but to believe, that her gift would not remain hidden. That the world had finally seen her, and that she was ready to step forward. And so the waitress who had once played in secret, who had once been mocked by a millionaire, now stood on the threshold of a new life. A life where her music was not only heard but celebrated, a life where her voice could no longer be silenced. The cruelty of one man had tried to crush her, but instead it had lit the fire that would carry her to places he could never reach. She smiled through her tears, knowing deep in her soul that this was only the beginning.